Welcome back to the Artist Forge Live. It is the first Friday that we are getting together in the afternoon instead of in the morning. So if you are here, we are super, super happy to have you. I know it's going to take a little while for us to get used to this change in schedule, but hopefully it just makes it better and more accessible to everybody. So if you are here today, we hope you will say hi in the comments. My name is Nicole York. I will be your host. Joining me today are the wonderful and talented and lovely Becca Bjorky and Bassam Sabah. Hello.
Hello.
How is everybody today?
Busy.
We know
Excellent.
Becca's confused about life. How are you, Bassam?
Very well, thanks. Working hard, lots of stuff to do, but can't complain. All good, all good.
Good. That's what I want to hear. Dennis is with us today. Hello, Dennis.
Hello, Dennis.
And Crystal. Hi, Crystal. So glad you're here. Dennis saying, love the new time. Much easier for me to join in. That's what we're hoping.
There you go.
Yes. All right. So if you have been with us over the last, month and 2 months, somewhere around in there, we have been talking about visual literacy. Visual literacy meaning the way that we interpret the things that we see and how that translates to us as artists. And so we have covered the kind of 3 main pillars of visual literacy, which is the external language of the image, the context of the image, and the internal language of the image. So where you see a piece of art and how the place that you see it and the situation that it's in gives context to the piece of art and helps you interpret it. Then the things that the artist has included in the image itself, things like the subject matter and the color, the composition, all of that stuff. And then the external language of the image being what the artist has purposefully included with the art, such as an artist statement or the title of the image, and how those things also influence the interpretation of the art. And we've gone through almost everything except composition. We saved that for last because it's probably the biggest and most complex thing to talk about because of all of the different ways that the subject matter and how it is arranged affect composition. So we're going to go over some examples today, beginning with just the regular old examples to get a good feel for what composition looks like. And then we'll look at images and see what parts of composition we can pick out. So if you've never actually heard composition defined before, essentially composition is just the organization of elements, the pleasing, hopefully, organization of elements within a piece of art so that you either can more easily track what's happening so you can understand what's happening. And composition also can affect the mood and the tone. So depending on the type of composition you choose, and we'll look at that as well. But essentially, it's just how things are organized, basically. And that can be either from a visual art standpoint, as in, painting, photography, things like that, or other visual types of art that are more sculptural in nature. Those have composition as well. Where are things arranged? How do they relate to one another? All of that stuff has to do with composition. So before we get started, does anybody have any initial thoughts or questions about composition that you want to make sure that we cover during this conversation? Because I know when I first started as a serious artist and getting into photography, I was like rule of thirds, and that's all that I knew. And maybe things like, contrast and leading lines. I think that was like the bulk of my understanding about composition. So if anybody else is in the same boat, don't worry. We're going to try to expand on that a little bit. But does anybody have any questions or anything you want to make sure, or any thoughts you want to get out into the ether before we start looking at examples?
Well, I think one of the things about composition that I find interesting is the nuances within a certain composition, all right? Or at least in a certain direction, right? So if you're taking somebody's headshot straight on, right? Like half an inch up, half an inch down makes a huge difference. And it would be nice to discuss why, if we have examples today, and like, what is that? It may not be obvious to everybody, but somehow you can inherently see it in some images. You say, what is it about these images? And it's usually the nuance in the composition and not necessarily the composition, right? So that's kind of something that I find intriguing. As an example, the rule of thirds is the obvious one that we all kind of jump on very early in our careers. But I had another photographer that I respect quite well look at some of my work, right? And he mentioned, and I didn't even know about it, and forgive me if I can't remember what it is exactly. But he said, when I look at your pictures, you put your point of focus slightly above the rule of thirds, the top line, and there's a definition for that. There's actually, I don't know if it's what's that?
Golden ratio.
The golden ratio. I don't know if it's related to the golden ratio, but the fact that it's slightly above that top line on the rule of third stood out to that individual, to that photographer, and I thought that was interesting. And he says, "You seem to naturally do it," and I had no clue that I'm doing it. So it's things like this that intrigue me more than, well, yeah, you need the leading lines and the rule of thirds, and if you have three individuals, it's nice to have triangles and so on. So yeah, I just hope we can kind of get into those kinds of discussions.
Yeah, this is definitely going to be a multi-day conversation, just so we can really explore composition kind of fully. And I think you're right, Bassam. It's those subtle elements and also how the different aspect of a composition play together. So most of the time we're using multiple things, right? We're using contrast, and we're using color, and we're using weight, and we're using shape language. So most of the time we have several things happening all at once. And it's great to see how those things are related and how they affect the overall composition. For sure. Justin is with us as well. Sorry to hear you're exhausted, friend. Hope the rest of your day will be a little bit better. And then a friend in Facebook saying the Fibonacci sequence.
Thank you. I'm just not sure if that's what it was, but that's the word I was looking for. Thank you. I'll never remember it, by the
way. That's fair. As long as you remember chiaroscuro, you need nothing else in art. That's the only important word. So yes, maybe that's actually something you could chat a little bit about, Becca, because I know that this is something that comes up between the two of us often. I don't have a hatred for math. I actually really think it's fascinating, but my early relationship with math was badly colored by teachers who did not understand the way I needed to learn about it. And so it wasn't until I was an adult and teaching my son math where I was like, how come nobody told me these things? How come nobody explained it to me this way? Because I felt like it was just a bunch of rules you had to follow to get a desired result. I didn't realize it was a language that's incredibly malleable in ways I couldn't understand as a kiddo. Like if somebody would have said, I'm going to teach you the language of the universe, I would have been like, what do you mean? But no, they're like, memorize this and repeat it. And if you don't do it this way, you're going to get it wrong. And that's not a good way for me to learn at all. But math, obviously, math and art.
Yeah.
And math.
I mean, it's interesting too, the way you just described that about like, these are these rules and this is what you have to do to follow, but really it's this language. And that's almost synonymous to how we've been talking about these ways of analyzing and creating art too, right? It's like, we're taught this is the rule of thirds, and this will immediately give you a great photograph. Like, okay, well, maybe, but it's again, understanding that particular form of language and things like the Fibonacci sequence. I mean, you see a lot of these math concepts even reflected in nature in ways that are already appealing to the human or maybe even the animal eye in general, right? You see these kind of similar sort of spirals, like in the growth of petals in a flower, or if you look at like a nautilus shell, right? That's a very classic example of something within this kind of like squarish or circular shape that still follows that same golden ratio. But I mean, there's other kinds of mathematics that also then apply to visual art. I mean, things like symmetry, like even when we're babies, right? And we look at like our parents' face and they have this like wonderful bilateral symmetry that's immediately appealing to us because it has this contrast and this reflection of shape and a pattern that is interesting to the baby's eye. And that's how we then learn to experience the world. So there are a lot of these kind of overlaps in math and art that you can then apply to your work if that's something that interests you. But if it isn't, like, whatever, it doesn't matter. I mean, math's kind of, it's conceptual, right? Like, does math actually even exist? Or is it just the language that we use to define these certain ideas? So it gets just as kind of maybe esoteric as art does. But there's definitely a lot of overlaps if you want to take that deep dive.
It's so cool to think about. And of course, when you're using things like ratios and balance and all of that good stuff, I mean, math absolutely comes into play there. And it's cool to think about so far back in history and art history, you can't look at things like Greek art and architecture without understanding the mathematics that go into what makes those buildings pleasing to the eye. And like you mentioned, the symmetry that's involved, even if they actually had to make things asymmetrical so they appeared symmetrical from the right angle, then that also plays into that. So it's just really, really fascinating.
And there's a bunch of like general kind of rules too, like in composition specifically, like kind of like this rule of threes, like not the rule of thirds, but like, you know, oh, if we stagger our objects within our scene within these kind of like 3 different sizes, like our big, medium, small, or just 3 specific objects, it lends this kind of interest to it more than say an even number might, depending on the effect you want to go for. So there are these like various kind of mathematical rules that you can follow if you want to, or at least like get written down by art experts and art teachers who want to teach you how to do cool art.
Yes. So it looks like our friend has got to go. Hopefully we will get you back. I'm really excited about today's conversation. Okay, we're going to start just looking at some examples. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And as I mentioned before, essentially composition is just the idea of how we arrange things within a piece of art, within a frame, within a scene, how the information is arranged so that it is pleasing, so that it is understandable, so that it communicates, all of that good stuff. And there are many different ways that we can do this. The 2 most kind of popular types of composition are obviously symmetry and asymmetry. And there's ways that we can look at that in terms of balance, right? So even if things are not the same, even if we have 2 shapes that are not the same, we'll talk about contrast later where shapes are concerned. There's a question of balance and how things balance. And we tend, in general, to want balance, whether that's balance of objects, balance of positive and negative space. And when things are not balanced, we tend to start getting uncomfortable. If a composition is imbalanced, we tend to get a little bit agitated. There isn't that same feeling of kind of comfort and peace as there is when something has that symmetry or that balance. Now, symmetry and balance are not the same thing. That's why I wanted to show this, because you have balance, but you don't have symmetry, right? Not at least perfect technical symmetry. So that's something to think about. And then oftentimes you will get people, particularly I've noticed this in, and y'all can tell me if you've had a different experience, but I've noticed this in competition spheres, they tend to prefer balance. And if you've chosen an imbalanced image, a composition that is not balanced, you tend to get docked for those things. And more often than not, I have seen that not go well for the photographer, even when the asymmetry or the imbalance was really purposeful, given the nature of the image and how it was put together. But have you guys experienced that at all? Or have I just had a strange experience with like watching people judge or being on judging panels?
No, I think we've seen that, and I think it happens often because the judges don't have that context, don't have the intent, aren't there to discuss it with the individual. So yeah, it could easily be seen as a non-intentional faux pas, right?
Sure.
No experience with competitions, can't say.
Yeah, I have not entered them, but I've been part of judging and I have watched judging happen. I'm not really interested in having in competing with my images, but I've seen that happen, and it always kind of irritates me because if the intention of the artist is to create tension, having that imbalance is going to do that. And if the subject matter and the purpose is toward that, then, and we've seen that with some of the classical art that we've looked at before, where you're like, oh, I don't like it, no.
Yeah,
and
this is very flashbacks to when we all looked at Kandinsky, and we're just
yes.
like...
We're like, oh, so uncomfortable. Okay,
yeah,
so
I remember that one. I can't remember which painting was that, with the woman completely off to the left of the picture,
yes,
falling off. Is that the one you're talking about, or no?
That's a different one, but the feeling's the same. Yeah. I remember thinking that too. And looks like Kelly is with us today. Hi,
hey,
lovely.
Kelly.
All right, so and then we're going to look at the organization. And so we've already mentioned the rule of thirds. We talked about the golden spiral and the Fibonacci sequence, but essentially the idea is that there are different ways that you can organize information in an image. And there are a couple of rules that you can choose to follow in order to facilitate the organization of that image. Now, this one might not make any sense, but if you were to lay out a golden spiral here, this black circle would fall right in the area of interest. And I can show that just by if you work in Photoshop, you have this really great little tool here. If you open up your crop tool and then you come up to the top, you can actually choose some of these rules and it will overlay that for you. So you can see where the rule of thirds would fall in an image like this. You can see where your diagonals run, your golden triangles, the golden ratio itself, and then of course the golden spiral. So you can see those overlays. So that's just a fun tool to use. But the idea is that these are kind of recreations of things that we find pleasing. And depending on what other information is in the scene, then you'll be able to see, so a golden spiral. This might not make much sense either. But as we talked about, having things arranged in triangles is pleasing for us, whether that's because we've picked that up from nature or what, but we like to see things in groups of threes. And so if you were to come in here and, if you were to come in here and draw those, that's a really big brush. Of course, you can gather these into many groups of threes and your eye will ping pong around within those spaces. And of course, people who photograph families or groups will often do this and arrange heads in groups of threes. And we'll look at faces a little bit later as another one of those kind of compositional elements that controls the eye. And then another one is the rule of thirds. So the rule of thirds, obviously being dividing up the image into two sets of three, and then positioning areas of interest or focal points along the connection of those areas. So over here, along these lines, over here, and those just tend to form good places for focal points. Mm-hmm. All right, so we can organize according to those different rules. We also have layout, and those are things that photographers, any photographers, are going to be familiar with. Things like leading lines within a frame that point to where the focal point will be, or how you frame something itself. So is there foreground elements you can use to frame? Are there legs you can use to frame? How can you put things that fill up the area of negative space that you're not interested in so that the focal point in that area of positive space get focus? You also have the use of positive and negative space. And so when we look at an image like this, you can still consider this a balanced image given the amount of white space that it takes to handle the weight of something like a black circle. And a lot of times in the kind of art that I just lost, Becca, what's its name?
Which kind?
Abstract, thank you. A lot of times in abstract art, you'll see the rules of composition really pushed down to their most simple. And that's, I think, when you can see a lot of the power. And people get really irritated when they see abstract art that is something like this. They're like, it's a dot on a circle, on a square, on a paper. But really, often what they're doing is showing you the very bones of composition. And so that's kind of what makes things like that so interesting. And then you have things like the balance of positive and negative space, how much space is being taken up by the visual elements versus how much negative space is there and how those things balance each other out. And then we have faces. So I mentioned before that if there is a face, your eye will go there, even if it is not a very obvious human face. If it seems to have eyes and a mouth, and maybe, you know, if a nose might be there, you will find it. Your eyes cannot help it. You are fitted by evolution to look for faces, like Becca mentioned in the beginning of the conversation. As infants, your eyes will go to the face of your parent. And you've probably experienced this in nature. You will find faces in trees or rocks or clouds or anywhere else. Your eye will just go to that face, even if it's a hint of a face or looks like a face. And the other thing where faces are concerned and composition is concerned is eye line, because humans are social creatures, we look and see what other people are looking at. And if you look at a photograph or a painting where there are several people, if you watch where the artist has directed their eye line, that will tell you where you are also going to be looking. You almost can't help it. If other people are looking at something, that is what you're going to look at as well. And then we have contrast, and I'm using these really broadly, so I hope that they, because I want to make sure that we cover these just so that once we start looking at the images, we get to break these things down. But contrast is one of the more powerful tools that we have because it is another evolutionary trigger. So our eye will always immediately go to the area of highest contrast. And we tend to think of that in terms of tonality, but that's not always necessarily the case, as we're going to see. Contrast in total is one of those things that's really powerful. So I mentioned tonality, right? The area of highest contrast is the area that our eye is going to shoot to, but that's not the only thing. We can have contrast in terms of scale or size or weight, right? If the room is filled with tiny little balls and there's one huge ball, even if they're all different colors or all the same, your eye is going to look for that contrast. So weight and scale can be something. Tonality can be something. Saturation is another way where your eye will go to the area of highest saturation. Color, obviously, another really strong one. And of course, this makes sense as hunter-gatherers. We needed to be able to tell the difference between things like berries we could eat or couldn't eat. We needed to be able to, tell those differences. And then we also have things like motion. So motion is another evolutionary trigger. If something moves, we'll see it. As hunters, that's an important part. And also as prey, being able to protect ourselves, that's an important part. So if something moves, we will see it. If something is a different shape, our eye will go there as well. So contrast in shape, contrast in movement, contrast in color, in saturation, in tonality, all of those things. Let me turn these off real quick. All of those things are ways that we can control where the viewer's eye goes, what they see first, what they see next, how that information is organized, right? So that was just a really simple, just broad, overlay of what composition is like. And then we're going to actually start looking at images and see if we can see what is being used there. So I have a few images of my own. Becca has also shared a few images from other artists. So we'll look and just see if we can figure out what's happening in terms of composition. So if we're to look at an image like this, and I'm going to start drawing on it in a minute, but I want to start with our friends in the audience. So when we look at an image like this, what do we see in terms of composition? Like, what are the things that stick out? Could you tell how this was organized? If you're in the audience today, go ahead and put that in the comments. What do we see? Remember, we've got things like...
I think you talked about groupings, or was it groupings you said?
Yeah.
Yeah, grouping different shapes and...
For sure. I mean, we can see that just in...
Right.
Tell me what I can and can't do. Photoshop. So we obviously have many triangles, right? And then so we have all of those that we can be looking
but there's also an element of imbalance there, because there's kind of a break in the pattern at the bottom right, with the two people on the bottom right, as opposed to being laid out like the other people.
Right.
So that's kind of the first thing your eye goes to, that, imbalance, or
the break in the pattern.
The break in the pattern, exactly.
Yes, which is something I didn't include in the aspects of composition, but that's a big one as well. The break in the pattern is a big one. Yeah.
Which also makes that empty space between them kind of loud. Also, the white space, even though it's balanced everywhere else, it's kind of, your eye goes to that bright spot because it's a different size than the rest of the space.
Right. It's a lot less even. Kelly picking up Fibonacci stuff. Okay, so let me...
Yeah, let's see that.
Yep. Let's do this overlay real quick.
Oh, she saw those two hands there in the middle. Okay. Two arms.
So we very carefully have this happening. It was really intentionally laid out that way. So let me show you too what that looks like. Oops. In terms of how these are connected, right? So we've got this and this. We have a curve here. We have this curve here, right into here. We can't see his face, but we know where his eye line is going. And then, of course, we've got this into here. So these are the only like absolutely connected eyes in the whole image. Even though we still have an almost connection happening here, it's not quite. So this is meant to happen, but this, like, there's more of it happening there. So Kelly's absolutely right. We have the golden spiral there. Let's also look in terms, let's also look in terms of areas of contrast. So here's where our brightest, things are happening. So we can see that the highlights here, let me delete that. So we can see that the highlights here have been protected where a lot of other highlights have been pulled down. So that's another thing happening. But in terms of overall contrast, it's a relatively low contrast image. In terms of overall color, it's a relatively monotone. We're right within kind of greens and browns. And so there's the green and brown are happening, but it's not super high like we've seen with other times. You know, like behind me, the reds and greens and yellows and the wallpaper are really, they really stand out. This, we have some greens and reds, but they're not crazy. Just enough to provide that contrast between the subjects and the smoke, as Kelly was saying.
From a contrast perspective, I don't know what Kelly's saying there about contrast, but the woman down at the bottom, the third, and then the man are kind of the only figures that are not covered by the clouds or the smoke, or so there's you can see the contrast; they stand out.
Yep. So I'm not going to stay here. We're going to look at this as well, just really fast, just to see the similar things, the similarity between these and what's happening, where we've got these triangles happening, and these are quite a bit more even and purpose. You know, like the spacing is quite a bit more even, and so even just there, we can kind of see that happening. So I'll grab Kelly's comment real quickly. So she's mentioning the warmth of the bodies versus the coolness of the smoke, the dark shadows versus the low contrast, which is absolutely true. So those are just some aspects of composition. Obviously, not every aspect of composition is being used here, right? Like not everything is coming into play as far as like shape language and color contrast and visual weight and all of those things. Not everything is being used. And I think that's important for us to remember when we're creating images of our own. Just like with all the other areas of visual literacy, we don't have to include every aspect all the time of everything. If you were to take a guess at what the main element of composition for an image like this is, what would you say?
More Fibonacci.
More Fibonacci. La 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 la.
Right at her lip, yeah.
There's also framing, right? Like these are not interesting areas here as much. Like you could almost look at all of this as if it's just a kind of relatively interesting negative space because it's all leading right there.
Yeah.
She's also making eye contact with the camera. And that is always going to be something that will pull.
That curve is always what's most interesting to me. Like I love a golden spiral. Like I have a problem and I need an intervention. those outer curves before the focal point are always the most interesting to me, at least within creating and then looking at them too. So like even if it is, yeah, maybe just useless negative space, it's not useless though. It's
Right.
fine. That journey, that visual journey for your eye, right up to that focal point, and that's always, to me, the like most interesting part beyond what we're actually supposed to be looking at.
Right. Yeah,
Nicole,
I agree.
Did you receive my pictures, Nicole, by any chance?
I have to check.
Oh, I sent them by email because there's a picture of a
okay.
there's a portrait of a woman that's kind of not similar to this, but it kind of made me think: is it really the Fibonacci? I think the Fibonacci also applies in that case, and I was just curious. But anyways, that's why.
Yeah, we'll have to.
I didn't think about it until you drew it on this one.
Yep. Yeah, we'll have to lay it over and see. Kelly also mentioning too the red. So this is all very yellow and relatively monotone until we get to right here. So that color contrast we have. So we've got Fibonacci sequence. We have this kind of pleasing curve of the shape language. We have the red in the contrast there. We have the face, and then of course the eye contact. So all of those things contributing to that image compositionally. And so this one has what photographers love, which is just a buttload of leading lines, right? Like we love that. We like to put leading lines in everything. We're like, how can I make the environment point to where I want people to look? So we've got, leading lines here. We have leading lines here. We have framing happening here. We have the lines of the chair and the lines of everything just going in that general direction. She's also the brightest spot in the image because of the white that's there. We have face, which we're automatically going to go to, even though this is also another relatively monotone image. It's all in kind of browns and oranges and yellows, where our eye is always going to go right there because it's been put together that way.
I'm largely appreciating the balance here with that empty chair too. That strikes me immediately because I don't think it would have the same impact without that extra weight.
Yeah, I would agree. It's kind of making this whole thing happen right here.
Mm-hmm.
And similarly, with an image like this, where we have a leading line and a leading line and a leading line, and we have framing, and we have a leading line, and we have, the contrast between her hair and her skin and the kind of brightness that's happening in the window up there. So like all of those same elements coming into play for an image like this, which is, I think, these are a little more painterly to me in terms of choice, like composition choice, and these are much more photographic to me in terms of composition choice. And I don't know why, but it just reads like that to me for some reason.
Uh-oh. Orange alert.
Yep, we get those too. So composition choices here. What are we doing? Kelly's leaving us. No, bye, friend. Have fun. Yeah, eat all the ribs. Oh, I'm so jealous now. So what would we say is going on here in terms of composition choices?
Value contrast and some nice classical rule of thirding.
Rule of thirding. Let's try a couple layovers really quickly and see, or overlays, I should say, and see what we can get out of here. So if we were to flip this bad boy, our spiral would end up here, which is not ideal, right? Although the gun definitely playing a more important part there. Our triangle is working for us. We looked at, so here we are in golden ratio, finding we're right kind of in the sweet spot of golden ratio and rule of thirds. So if even just looking at overlays there, to see where things fall. And I think compositionally for me too, Justin saying, it's not fair that I know the character. This is true. I actually photographed Justin and Scott same day. We'll actually see a picture of you, Justin, in just a minute. So you mentioned value contrast. We have color contrast. We also have, so let's look at that value contrast here. All of the bright stuff happening right here. If we were to increase the saturation of everything, we can see reds versus yellows and greens. But the main thing for me in an image like this one is the really purposeful asymmetry and the balance between the subject matter and all the negative space, which I think also creates that sense of loneliness, right? And that sense of kind of empty space and the sense that this character is all by themselves. And like compositionally, I think that's important for this story.
And also I find, where you place them in the picture. So on the left third or the right third contributes a lot to the story. Is there more behind them, or there's more coming up in terms of storyline? Is it about what happened, or is it about what's about to happen? Right. In this case, it tells me it's about what happened, but I know the storyline. It's the opposite, actually, isn't it? It's not about what happened. It's about what he's about to do, or was it the other way? I can't remember. The actual storyline of I think shooting a friend or killing a friend or whatever.
Yes, yeah, of having to potentially confront somebody. Yeah.
Okay, so it's the opposite. It's the opposite of what it's giving me in terms of storyline here.
Well, and he's doing the thing that they often don't like, which he's facing out of the frame, like he's about to leave it. So whether he's coming from or going to, you still kind of get that sense of like moving on to something big, like something big has happened. This is a whole, so Justin asking, we photographed a whole separate set of images out on White Mesa, where we did a kind of outlaw themed story. And this actually wasn't part of that one. So this was photographed later in my garage. He was not on location for this. This is a composite. He was in my garage, and I shot this particular shot on the mesa behind my house the day before, and then stuck him in.
Can I make a request?
Yes, ma'am.
For impact's sake, can you center crop that?
Mm-hmm.
And I know I won't like it, but I feel like it's important.
Nope.
No. Not that it's bad, but now it's no longer telling a story. At least not in that same way.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree. Like, it's always going to be nice because of all the other elements that make it nice. The interesting subject matter and the color and the lighting and all of that stuff, the expression, the body language, all those things we always talk about, but it's missing the rest of the story. I 100% agree.
What were you thinking, Bassam? I saw you thinking.
I was thinking even ratio, like this is 2:3, but even if you go 3:4 versus 16:9 on the same image, I wonder which of the four we would like most. Obviously, the center one wasn't, lost a lot. I wonder if the other ones would enhance the story. You can't do it because you don't have content in there. But
yeah, use content aware.
You can do on the 4:5, but not 16:9. Well, maybe
sure,
you lose some of the person, but of Justin.
Yeah. We'll just.
Shift F5, enter.
You can do it with the crop tool automatically too.
Yeah.
See, I haven't even been doing any of this stuff lately, so you guys are like way ahead of me on things that we can do.
That still works.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it still works because the idea is the same, right? Like,
yeah, but I guess the point is experiment with aspect ratios.
Yeah.
Right, regardless how it was shot.
Oh.
Yep, I
I've
would
been in
agree.
a super wide problem lately. I've been doing everything in 21:9 and it's insane.
No, I don't blame you. I love having all of that space to use or not to use. So similar thing happening here. What could we pick out if you're in the audience today? What are some of the main aspects of the composition that you see here? Like is there a first big thing that jumps out to anybody?
Yeah, him. I mean, it's everything else is secondary. It's in your face.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of kind of what we talked about before, that negative space that gives you context, but it's not the positive. It's not the super interesting stuff. It's just kind of contextual. It's color for me. Nothing jumps out as much as the color for me.
I actually feel like that highlight on his face even more than that pop of red. Like there's a lot of obvious of color contrast there, but the red itself isn't.
It's toned down.
Overtly saturated, yeah.
It's been toned with blue, yeah.
Yeah.
So we have color contrast. We have
framing of his face with the gun and his lapel.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that V shape.
For sure, yeah.
And his shirt also. I mean, there's
we've got
kind of two superimposed V's, yeah. And then the one,
so we've got kind of this stuff happening here.
But even his shirt, the opening in the shirt is the same. Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of how my eye goes, like looking at it at first. First, I'm looking at that highlight on the cheekbone. And then I go to the gun. I don't go to the rest of the face. And then gun, down, shirt, opening, lapel, up to the face.
Right. With that moon bothering you all the time, right?
No,
it does. I mean, I don't go to it. I don't go to it. It's not really important, but it's there. It adds to the picture, but it does strain your eye that way.
That's interesting. So if it was more balanced, say on the left, like camera left, would it bother you less?
If there was less what?
If there was another like point of brightness, like the moon, but
even if there was like white you know, the wave breaks on the water, right?
Oh yeah, that would actually work
right
well,
like things like that would have balanced it out a bit, and it wouldn't hurt the picture. Yeah.
Okay, so we saw some things that are happening in there. Those were our examples.
This was my favorite.
So if you're in the audience today, what is the main type of compositional elements that we're seeing happen here?
Oh, sorry, was that Justin also in the last picture?
That was Justin, yeah.
Okay, that's why he's talking about his nose.
Yeah.
Cool, Justin. I want to be cool like that.
I know, Justin is super rad. I have lots of photos of him. He's great.
I also have a big nose. I can look cool in a pirate costume.
Hey, noses are power, man. People overlook how powerful noses are. Not this artist, though. This artist knows how powerful noses are.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Come on, y'all. What do we see?
Leading noses.
Leading noses.
Add that to my list of future band names.
100% true. Remember, we talked before about number 1, eye line, right? But we also have the leading line here of eyes to nose happening.
Yeah.
So absolutely, that's one of the things that are going on. Look at the repetitive shape language that's framing too. Look at all these.
Yeah.
All of this repetitive shape language that goes all the way around her. These ones are really tiny. These ones are larger. So Justin mentioning the glow. So we have value contrast, right? She is 100% the brightest thing.
And of course, the opposite, those receding shadows out towards the frame.
Yep. Everything gets progressively brighter the closer it gets to her.
And I love this centered composition that still remains environmental. Like this artist, John Bauer, does this very well in all his work, a lot of his work. He maintains this very centered composition, but still manages to capture so much of the environment. It's not necessarily focused on the subject. and he manages to balance it, like we've already talked about, with these repetition of shape and the very, very purposeful use of light. It's rad.
And also, I think the fact that we have like all of these very soft, very round, and she's a very upright figure in the midst of all of this roundness. So you have not a whole bunch, but enough, I think, contrast and shape language there also to make her stand out, even if we were to dim her down. In fact, let's see what happens. Even if we remove a lot of her glow, she's still the most important part of the scene.
Yeah. And it maintains that kind of like upward rhythm of movement through the shape too.
Yeah. So we don't have a whole lot of color contrast going on as far as pure color, right? But we have a lot of value contrast. We have shape contrast. We have those leading lines. We have the eye lines that we talked about before. So that's all contributing to pulling this composition together. I love this one too. So what do we see here compositionally?
Asymmetrical perfection.
Where does your eye immediately go?
To the top of the arch, the circle, the globe. I see a globe in the sky.
Let me make this smaller. So your eye goes here, Bassam.
It just, yeah, exactly.
Interesting.
I mean, the white leading up to the blue, and everything is framing that area. And then I realize there's people in the picture, right? In the after the fact.
Yeah. So I'm Justin saying the same thing. His eyes go to the arch as well. And you said, Becca, yours as well. First thing is the arch.
And then we travel down.
Yeah. So we go like
then
this.
You go to that bottom left there and the cup. Yeah, right there.
Yep. And then we have this another bright thing here. It draws up. So we obviously have that really, really purposefully done by the artist.
I go opposite of that. That's interesting.
You go this way?
Uh-huh.
Mm-hmm.
It's so pretty.
It is. And then my eye actually bounces around down here.
Yeah.
So then what are we actually looking at here? Our eye goes to the arch because why?
Color.
It's color, and it's value. I mean, it's if you brightness.
Okay.
The perceived brightness. I can't tell which is brighter, the blue or the red, but perceived lightness. Yeah, there you go. Right, but still, before you even move that slider, the bottom barely showed up. The red doesn't show, the reddish orange.
Yep.
So, yeah.
Okay, so we've got.
But there's also it's not symmetrical. It's kind of off to the right hand side, and that brings you there, right? Just the fact that the image it's not in symmetry as such.
Mm-hmm.
And all I can think of is a drone going through it and filming it, from the left.
I think so. We have color contrast there. We have contrast in value there. We also. So we have uprights, horizontals, uprights, horizontals, but then we have an arch, we have an arch, we have an arch, we have an arch, and they progressively get smaller as we also go down toward the ladies. So even in shape language, the fact that all of these are 90-degree angles, and then we have this, right? Like, so that these things happening are also part of the kind of compositional language of the image.
Rhythm.
Rhythm.
We've also got more threes.
We do. We have threes here. And then we have the broken fourth, which is a kind of a tetradic type of thing to do.
Oh, but even in the pillars, right? We have, I mean, these three kind of major points. I mean, obviously there's more than three, but there's three, again, that big, medium, small.
Yeah, yeah. Big, medium, small. Yep. And then, of course, this is all framing. So all this is nice and dark. So framing is happening as well. Lots and lots of compositional things happening there. All right, what's happening here? Audience friends, what do we see compositionally that is controlling how we look at, understand, etc. this image?
It's so simple, but there's so much happening.
Yeah, I know. I mean, it's partially luminosity, and there I do see leading lines also with the background, exactly.
And that color.
Color.
It's very visceral. That. Yeah. Eyes, right? That's one of the things we talked about. We look for faces, we look for eyes, we look for eye line. And especially if a subject is making eye contact with the camera, that is an immediate place that our eyes are going to go to. Also, leading lines mentioned by our friends in Facebook land.
I mean, you even have that framing with that noir style lighting that has a name I can't remember.
Yeah, happening here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that very intentional use of shadow, like creating negative space where obviously there are things, but they're not important.
I also like these. This is the blue. There's a really great also actually repetition happening here.
Yeah. And it's cool how things like that, those moments of repetition, I mean, they're just naturally occurring as constructed as they may be. I mean, that's just how the light is going to fall, and you're going to have this sense of repetition and shape, and again, that rhythm from nature itself.
Yeah. So we have color contrast happening, we have value contrast happening, we have that use of eye contact happening, contrast in the type of light. So we've obviously got backlight coming in from here, front light coming in from here. Also,
I feel like the framing is very, very important to this composition too.
His eyes are low, aren't they?
Well, more that the fact that it almost looks like it's cropping the chin, but it's not a 3/4. It's not a full body. It's putting us in this very intimate moment with the character. Like it's up close, it's personal, and would not have the same effect if it was wider.
No. Yeah, and I think that choice of cropping, that's an uncomfortable crop.
Yeah, it's like this is where you need to, you would put his eyes up on the third, right?
Right. Yeah.
And
if you were trying to make it traditionally like pleasing, right? If we were to pull that up here, if we were going to make it traditionally pleasing, we got to kind of match older cinematic things, then he would be there.
Yeah.
But you can't be, because we don't want pleasing, we want discomfort.
Yeah.
Love it. We've only got a few more minutes, so let's keep going and see how much more we can get through. So we've got a few compositions happening here.
I feel terrible for really enjoying this. That lovely triangle.
It's
a triangle.
Really triangle-y
it's
triangle.
Framing. It's leading lines. Even contrast, because the three elements are extremely dark compared to the rest.
Also, we have this big open blue space here,
right?
and
Which is that framing.
Yep. And contrast at the same time, right?
More beautiful natural vertical rhythm.
Yep. So we've got
Can
all
you guys
these.
tell what I like yet?
La 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 la. We have all of them. Here we go again. And we're going right into the landscape and into the landscape. We have the threes.
Yeah, that Schoolhouse Rock 3 is the magic number. We just need
Yep. We have the contrast happening. We have what we talked about before, which is our big and our medium and our smaller, and then our much smaller, so we know things are happening over there. Let's see where, just for shits and giggles. Let's start up here. This is not going to be exact, but see where things fall. Whoops, that's not the one we want. Stop it. So very much framing within our diagonals there. Look at the exactness. Everything's happening right in here. What about down here? So rule of thirds. Framed in the center of these diagonals. Not so much using our triangles there.
I mean, their heads are actually kind of following that.
Mm-hmm.
Creating
that.
Yeah.
That's true. Yep. On for the golden ratio, though. And then obviously, if we were to switch, we kind of end up with our spiral right over here. So what about this one? I'm going to remove that. What do we see when we're looking at this bottom one here? Besides some really bad teeth.
Yeah, I was going to say.
How is this compositionally working here?
Impactful, serves its purpose. Interesting. It's not at you. It's not at the viewer.
No. We also have this happening.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm feeling the line from the vest or the jacket up to the eye down.
Mm-hmm.
That worm's eye view is like,
Yeah. We have the eyes again. So we talked about faces and how we want that. We also have the kind of natural framing that's happening here. These lines are kind of coming up into the sky and going everywhere, but they're not playing a huge role compositionally. If this was an empty sky, it would still be just as strong, I think, compositionally.
Yeah, I mean the angle of the camera really gives it.
Yeah.
Gives it.
And it's unexpected, right? Which is another one of those similar things happening. Repetition, framing, contrast, all this contrast. We can't say on everything. We're just going to try to. Okay, I'm curious to hear what is the thing that stands out. Yeah, okay, so Crystal mentioned in the other one that his the tree was mimicking the shape of his body, the way he was leaning, which I think is a great observation. I'm really curious to hear for this one what first thing is that pops out to people compositionally. Because I have something that is the thing for me that draws my eye more than anything else. And I wonder if I'm the only one.
Mountain camera, right?
This one?
Mm-hmm.
If there's anybody in the audience, if you have a thing you see immediately, like it's the thing that sticks out to you the most, I'm really curious to know. So crystal for her, she's saying color. So we've got some greens happening, and then mostly everything else is yellow. You know what it is for me?
I'm gonna. Oh no.
This is it for me.
What do you call that?
It's shape language, and it's pattern breaking, so it's both. So we have in the mountains all of these big, like upward reaching curves, and then here in this trees we have these very, very lateral, almost kind of slashing, like, and that's the only other. This is the only place in this image where these shapes happen, is right there. Everything else is curved, curved, curved. Even this is curved. Everything is curved except the way these trees are laid out. And I can't not see it. Like it's the first and most immediate thing that sticks out to me when I look at this. Let's look at value as well. So value-wise, the darkest parts instead of the brightest parts, right? The darkest parts are actually where the value composition lies in this one, because all the darks are here.
Yeah.
Framing the house.
I like the weight in this a lot.
Mm-hmm. This is the kind of asymmetric composition that's my favorite, that I really love in Chinese and Japanese oil paintings and ink paintings.
It a lot, even in like landscape photography, concept art, notorious for this like exact kind of composition, or establishing shots in movies are set up like this with that. Usually, often on the right hand side, that heavy weight and the height, and then the space.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's worth pointing out. I mentioned earlier when we were looking at the kind of tenets of composition, we talked about the fact that balance and symmetry aren't the same, right? And this is a perfectly balanced image because we have all of this bright, pale, negative space up here, and we have a similar amount of dark, positive space down here, and those things balance each other out, even though this is not a symmetrical image. So lovely balance with asymmetry. And last image of the day.
See, there it is.
What's up, nerds? You all nerds know what this is from.
But here we have that similar approach.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at even just the size of this bright positive space and the size of this bright positive space, super, super similar in size. And then we have some great shape language happening in sets of threes as well. And we have all of this.
And chiaroscuro.
And chiaroscuro, the one word you need to know. Which, if you've never heard that before, it's the contrast of light and dark in pattern, light and dark and light and dark.
I wanted to mention about your smoke image earlier too. It was a very subtle but purposeful use of that created that pattern. But you have that obviously different approach here where you have your shadow, your light, your shadow, your light.
Right.
So yeah. Something's bothering me about the composition here. And it's how close the horse is to the edge of the image. It's almost like it was sloppily cropped.
Yeah, I think that's one of those unfortunate things of grabbing screenshots from films is that if you pause it like a half a second later, he's here, saying, right?
I know, but I'm just talking about the actual image.
Yes. Yeah, I would agree. If somebody were to take this as a photograph, I would be like, he's too close to the bottom, y'all.
I would
agree with you there.
But I mean, Nicole, I don't know how well you have the movie memorized. Is he writing in?
He's writing in
kind of curve.
Yeah, because here's Pippin's leg.
Well, no, I know he's going to wander, but like the shape that he is then creating. I mean, you see this in film a lot. When the way people are blocking their shots when they're.
Yeah, I feel like it's that way.
Yeah, it's going to be following these compositional lines anyway, just through motion.
Yeah. Yeah. Pachow. All right.
I wanna go
So I'm going to go ahead and stop the screen share. And just so we can kind of close everything down for today. But we looked at some of the tenets of composition, which essentially, as we said earlier, if you were not here for the explanation, composition is basically just a word to describe how you organize pieces of information in a piece of visual art. Where is everything at? How does it relate to each other? And there's all of these different ways that you can go about finessing a composition, from contrast and things like shape and color and saturation and hue, to the as we saw earlier, rhythm in shape language. Those are things, breaking patterns, weight, so visual weight of positive and negative space. There's just a whole crap ton of different like aspects of composition that you can use to create an image that is either pleasing or uncomfortable, depending on what your intention are. If you know how to break those rules, then you will know, I want this image to feel uncomfortable for the people who are looking at it. Then cut off Hannibal Lecter's chin, apparently. That's how you do that, right? So we're going to continue talking about composition, and we will look at that, I think, in the coming week when we're looking at images, and we'll just make sure that that is an important part of what we're looking at, is how has this been put together compositionally? What can we learn from the artist, and how and where they placed things like, as Bassam and Becca mentioned, even just the bright collar of a shirt that can become a framing object or a leading line. So all of these different ways that you can put something together to create a composition that speaks and helps people understand your image. Is there anybody in our audience today hanging out who has any questions, like anything you guys want to know or questions you want to throw at the three? There's the time to do that. But before we're waiting for that, and while we close down, Becca, Bassam, do you guys have any final thoughts on the kind of introduction to composition that you'd want to leave people with?
When you talked about V, look at our pictures right now as we appear on the screen, how your shirt is framing your face a heck of a lot more nicely than Becca, but even twice as nicely as mine, because mine is pretty straight. Becca's, but you could see that. I mean, look how live example.
I brought my frame with me.
Oh yeah, here.
Yeah. Your hair is doing like 20 times the work of my shirt. But yeah, I mean, even us here, we're creating a V, right? We've got that going on.
Yeah.
Totally true. Anything else you think you want to leave folks with about composition?
I'm gonna go back and look at some of my images and superimpose those patterns on them, right? I mean, the thirds is obvious, but putting the spiral and I think I'm gonna learn a lot. I'm curious.
I would recommend also for the golden spiral, I use a PNG of it because Photoshop is stupid and doesn't let you flip the frame.
Yeah, you have to flip the picture, right? I was just doing that. I had to flip the picture four different ways to get it, and like
totally. I use a PNG all the time, and I just flip it, and I'll do every possible angle just to double check myself, just because it's my favorite.
And you can enlarge it. I guess it's easier to zoom in and out or make it larger and smaller, right?
Yeah.
With the PNG. Okay, that's a good.
Yep. Overlays are super helpful. So I would suggest doing exactly what Bassam mentioned, not just in your own work, but I'd go find some of the things that are your favorites and go and see if you can find patterns there, because people often will default toward specific types of compositions. And often that's another one of those things that lends towards seeing an artist's voice or, their aesthetic in their work, is they will tend towards certain types of compositional choices. And maybe we'll look at some illustrations next week and see if we can see, because obviously as photographers, we're often working with what we have and what we can gather in a scene. Illustrators and painters are they make every single choice that exists in an image. And so in those cases, you have to be kind of a compositional master, and you're making very purposeful choices in color, contrast, and saturation and hue and all of those things, where we often manipulate those things in post-production as well. So we go back and we kind of fiddle with everything to make it fit. But I think, going through and looking at even more paintings just to see what choices were made also might be super helpful. So
yeah, that threshold layer trick for the Photoshop users too. I don't remember where I picked that up, but I started doing that like a couple years ago too, and it's just so helpful to start looking at those value changes and how the light moves within a scene. So if you go like make a new layer in Photoshop and you click threshold, that's that really high contrast thing Nicole was using, and it's super handy.
Yeah. It'll tell you where your brightest stuff is and where your darkest stuff is, and whether you choose to use the brightest part to draw the eye or the darkest part, as we saw in that Chinese ink painting. Either way works, and you're going to find out which things work for you. And then, like Bassam said, go look back at your own art and figure out, what have you been doing up until now? Like, what do you default to? What things do you just tend to want to do? And that will give you a really good idea about your own artistic choices, and maybe challenge yourself a little bit and see what can you do with symmetry. And in your own personal work, go try to shoot symmetrical stuff for a while and see how that feels, and then try to find asymmetry, and then try to play with balance and try to grab a few of those elements and see what you can do with them, because it can be a really interesting way to give yourself kind of an artistic kick in the booty. All right, y'all, thank you so much for joining us for the first afternoon live stream. We will be doing this again on Monday at 1 p.m. Mountain Time. That is noon for our friends on the West Coast and 3 o'clock p.m. for our friends on the East Coast. We're going to be doing that until visual literacy is over, and then we are switching to just Mondays at 1 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, and that's when we'll be getting together. So we hope you will join us for that. Come and talk about art junk with us. We're going to be a lot more casual in our conversations once visual literacy is over, where we're trying to like remind ourselves of things and teach ourselves stuff, and then we're going to let our hair fly. Fists, not fists. Yeah. Yours is going to have to do double work for mine, because mine doesn't do it. Mine just goes flat. Look at it. It's the saddest hair that ever tried to hair. Anyway, I'm going to go get myself like extensions or something just to try to make something happen. So thank you guys for being here. Hopefully you will join us. Crystal, we always love having you. Come hang out with us then. Until next week, have a fantastic weekend. Go make something amazing. We'll see you all on Monday. Bye, friends.
Bye.